Welcome back, class. Let's go ahead and review session number 2. In session number 2, we talked about the psychosexual stages of development that Freud proposed. We also discussed about the defense mechanisms which protect us from anxiety. Then we reviewed the psychodynamic theorists, those who are the neo-Freudians that followed Freud, and examined how their ideas support or change some of the core ideas that Freud proposed. We then looked at the inkblot projective test and saw some problems with it. We then examined in a big picture flaws in Freud's approach to his science. And then we reviewed how Freud's views are examined and looked at today, how they have fared. So basically, let's talk about why we still talk about Freud. Freud benefited psychology, giving us ideas about the impact of childhood on adulthood, human irrationality, sexuality, evil, defenses, anxieties, and so on. Freud gave us specific concepts we still use often, such as ego, projection, regression, and so on. So although somewhat of a controversial figure, he cannot be questioned with regards to his impact on the early days of psychology. So let's continue our conversation on personality. So developing a healthy, genuine human personality. This was the area that was of interest to Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers as they formed their own perspective on personality development. Maslow becoming a self-actualized person, Rogers growing in a social environment of genuineness and acceptance and empathy, and then how it is that we assess the self, and then evaluating these humanistic theories. So, humanistic theories of personality of Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers, two major proponents of this particular view. In the 1960s, some psychologists began to reject the dehumanizing ideas of behaviorism and the dysfunctional views of people in the psychodynamic school of thought. Maslow and Rogers sought to offer a third force in psychology, the humanistic perspective. They studied healthy people rather than people with mental health problems, a unique idea at this time. Humanism, focusing on the conditions that support healthy personal growth. So let's look at Maslow first. Now we are revisiting Maslow because we did talk about Maslow in a previous chapter on motivation and emotion. In Maslow's view, people are motivated to keep moving up a hierarchy of needs, going beyond getting the basic needs met. At the top of this hierarchy, we see self-actualization or fulfilling one's potential, and also self-transcendence, seeing that things exist and are important that go beyond ourselves. So, the notion is, in this ideal state, a personality includes being self-aware, self-accepting, open, ethical, spontaneous, loving, caring, focusing on a greater mission than social acceptance. So the idea here, the basic needs of biological needs, safety needs, the esteem and psychological needs, that there are things beyond that, such as self-actualization, being someone who can meet and fulfill their potential. And then self-transcendence needs the ability to see there's something more important than you as an individual, or you as a living person, that you will even sacrifice yourself for greater causes. So the self-actualizing person is sort of a way to become that individual that is a individual that is going to be highly developed individual and very positive. Then we have Carl Rogers' person-centered perspective. Rogers agreed that people have a natural tendencies to grow, become healthy, and move toward this self-actualization that Maslow proposed. The three conditions that facilitate growth, just as water, nutrients, and light facilitate the growth of a tree, according to Carl Rogers, is genuineness, being honest, direct, not using a facade, being a real person, Acceptance, also referred to as unconditional positive regard, acknowledging feelings without passing judgment. And empathy, tuning in to the feelings of others, showing your efforts to understand and listen well. So for Carl Rogers, perspective, person-centered, he thought the ability to become a more self-actualized person was to be able to facilitate growth through your genuineness, your unconditional positive regard, and your empathy. So assessing the self and humanistic psychology, ideal self versus actual self. So in the humanistic perspective, again, in the humanistic perspective, the core of personality is the self-concept, our sense of our nature and identity. People are happiest with a self-concept that matches their ideal self. So it's important to ask people to describe themselves as they are and as they ideally would like to be. Questionnaires can be used, but some prefer open interview. Questions about actual self. How do you see yourself? What are you like? What do you value? What are you capable of? If the answers do not match the ideal, self-acceptance may be needed, not just self-change. So the idea here, if we can think about it this way, if who you think you want to be and who you are very much aligned with each other, then we tend to be happier. If who we are and who we think we need to be are not overlapped or are not aligned, then we tend to be less happy. So we can also think of it as, for example, an ideal body image, for example. If you have an ideal body image and your actual body image are so greatly different, then there'll be some particular issue. But the more they are aligned with each other or overlap, then less issues would tend to result. So critiquing the humanistic perspective. Well, some say Rogers did not appreciate the human capacity for evil. Rogers saw evil as a social phenomenon, not an individual trait. When I look at the world, I'm pessimistic, but when I look at people, I'm optimistic, is a quote of Rogers. So, humanist response. Self-acceptance is not the end. It then allows us to move on from defending our own needs to loving and caring for others. So the notion here is that they are not fully accepting, the world isn't fully accepting of the ideas and views necessarily that the humanist perspective sort of promotes. So, critiquing the humanist perspective, some say that the pursuit of self-concept and accepting ideal self and self-actualization has encouraged not self-transcendence but self-indulgence and self-centeredness. That we're so focused on ourselves that we sort of raise ourselves up to a certain degree. So the humanist response would be the therapist using the approach should not encourage selfishness and should keep in mind that positive regard means acceptance, not praise. You accept somebody as who they are, but you're not necessarily praising them. So let's start our conversation now on trait theories, social cognitive theories, and the self. So getting to think about the qualities you may see in yourself. Traits are stable components of personality, be made up of dimensions or factors. We can use certain tools to assess these traits, like the MMPI, which is the Minnesota Multiphasic Inventory, personality inventory, the 5 Canoe factors, and then the impact of traits on situation and vice versa. So we have the social cognitive influence on personality, reciprocal determinism among thoughts, social situation and behavior, internal versus external locus of control, and optimism and positive psychology. We'll look at some of these as we go. The self-spotlight effect, self-esteem, and self-serving bias also. So let's look at trait theories of personality. Gordon Allport decided that Freud overvalued unconscious motives and undervalued our real observable personality styles and traits. Myers and Briggs wanted to study individual behaviors and statements to find how people differed in personality, having different traits. The Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, MBTI, is a questionnaire categorizing people by these traits. A trait, an enduring quality that makes a person tend to act a certain way. For example, honest, shy, or hardworking would be traits that we usually can associate with some people and others. MBTI traits come in pairs: judging versus perceiving, thinking versus feeling. So, trait theory of personality, that we are made up of a collection of traits, behavioral predispositions that can be identified and measured, traits that differ from one person to another person. Traits, are they rooted in biology? Well, we know, for example, from the brain. Extroverts, people who are more outgoing, gregarious, sort of like the life of the party, so to speak, extroverts tend to have low levels of brain activity, making it hard to suppress impulses and leading them to seek stimulation. They need more stimulation, so they're more outgoing, trying to obtain it. The body. The trait of shyness appears to be related to high autonomic system reactivity, of which we've talked about in class previously. That means they have a personal alarm system that is easily triggered. So these people, who may tend to be seen as shy, because of this highly sensitive autonomic system reactivity, they may want to try to cut down on stimulation, things going on around them at a party. So they may find some nice wall to stand next to so they can see who's approaching in this very tense and highly arousing environment. Genes. Selective breeding of animals seem to create lifelong differences in traits such as aggression, sociability, or calmness, suggesting genetic roots to these traits. That's the whole idea behind certain dog breeding approaches, where you can breed an animal to be more kind or gentle, or to be more aggressive and ferocious if they're going to be a guard dog. So we can use questionnaires to assess traits. So we have what is known as personality inventory, a questionnaire assessing many personality traits by asking which behaviors and responses the person would normally choose. Empirically derived tests. All test items have been selected because they predictably match the qualities being assessed. And then we have the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, designed to identify people with personality difficulties. These are a true-false questionnaire. Items were selected because they correlated with various traits, emotions, and attitudes. Example: depressed people tend to answer true to the item, "Nothing in the paper interests me except the comics." So by answering true to that, we tend to see that happen with people who have a trait of depression. The Big Five personality factors. After years and years of research on the ideas of personality, it was sort of determined that certain themes seem to always reappear. These themes were called the Big Five personality factors. So the Isaacs felt that people varied along two dimensions. Current cross-cultural research and theory supports the expansion from two dimensions to five factors. Here they are: conscientiousness, self-discipline, careful pursuit of delayed goals; agreeableness, helpful, trusting, friendliness; neuroticism, anxiety, insecurity, emotional instability; openness, flexibility, nonconformity, variety, and extroversion, drawing energy from others, sociability. So to help us remember the 5 factors, remember the first letters spell canoe. C for conscientiousness, A for agreeableness, N for neuroticism, O for openness, and E for extroversion. There are other techniques too that can be used, or mnemonics that can be employed, but canoe is good enough for here. So the big 5 canoe personality dimensions. So we see this little doggy up here, and we can sort of trace the characteristics of this little doggy, as we could also trace the characteristics of an individual. So here we see impulsive, trusting, anxious, conforming, and fun-loving. So what we see with this particular approach to the Big 5, whatever scale we employ, we can be trying to measure your degree of conscientiousness, either on one scale of being disorganized, careless, or impulsive, or more to the other, organized, careful, and disciplined, and so on and so forth. Now, one can imagine too that certain occupations or careers may be enticing for certain people of certain personality types. And research tends to support that as well. So, questions about traits. Stability. One's distinctive mix of traits doesn't change much over the lifespan. However, everyone in adulthood becomes more conscientious and agreeable, and less extroverted, neurotic, or unstable, and less open, imaginative, and inflexible. So, the predictive value. Levels of success in work and relationships relates to traits such as openness and conscientiousness. Heritability. For most traits, genes account for 50% of the variation among individuals. So let's see how these traits may stay the same or change over time. So, over years of development, we change interests and attitudes, roles, jobs, and relationships. We develop skills, maturity, and so on. Do traits stay stable through all this change? Well, the evidence shows that it takes time for personality to stabilize. Traits do change, but less and less so over time. We change less and become more consistent. So we look here at trait score correlations over 7-year period. We can see that there's going to be more consistency the older we become. But there is change that occurs throughout our lifespan. The person-situation controversy. Trait theory assumes that we have traits that are a function of personality, not situation. There is evidence that some traits are linked to roles and to personas we use in different cultural environments. Look at this cartoon here. I'm going to France. I'm a different person in France. This cartoon, although it may not be so funny, what it's pointing to the fact is that if you change your situation, you'll change the person. Because there's going to be some instances where we're going to be greatly influenced by the situation or the environment that we are in.